been raped not once, but twice. And this time I met a woman who was the third time raped after she'd been operated on 7 times and sent home and then come back. I don't think arms are the solution, but I do think empowering women to know their rights and then having women become local leaders who then fight for the kind of protection that women are entitled to is the solution.
And Eve, on that thought, an email, if I may follow up with, from Uganda, from Ian Uela, who wrote in saying, rape is a very manipulative weapon of war in Congo. Victims often remain quiet because they fear cultural stigma. This is something we touched on earlier. How are you finding that at the City of Joy, getting women to be able to feel confident and secure enough to be able to speak out?
Well, over the last 3 years, we did quite a few events called Breaking the Silence, where women who had been survivors of terrible sexual violence came forward in Goma, in Bunia, in Kinshasa, in Bukavu, and broke the silence. And by that I mean they stood up and they told their stories to hundreds of people publicly. And I think what that has done, and with a lot of other efforts of a lot of other groups, has begun to create a climate where women are saying the shame is not on me. The shame is on my perpetrator. And I think the more we can create worlds and create systems where women tell their stories and do not feel the shame and the guilt and the horror is something they've done, but is something that their perpetrators are responsible, the more we're going to shift. I think the hardest thing in the Congo is for women to break the silence and to go against tradition, because when a woman has been raped, often she is exiled, she is considered no longer part of a community, she is turned on by members of her family. And I think there is a growing V-Men movement, I'm really happy to say, where at least 200 men were at the opening who consider themselves V-Men, men who are standing up to stop the violence against women and girls in the Congo, and who understand that the life of women is seriously connected to the continuing of all life in the Congo. And I think more and more men are becoming activists, and more men are fighting for women's rights and for women to be protected and cherished and safe and empowered.
Now, Marcus, to expand the conversation a bit, the DRC has incredible mineral wealth. I mean, huge amount of mineral wealth, and it seems that's more of a curse than a blessing. And I wonder if you could just give us a basic idea on how that battle for the resources of Congo underpins what's going on.
Well, essentially, it's us as a consumer nation that have you know, the minerals that we find in DRC, the cassiterite, the gold. None of these are actually consumed in DRC. They're all consumed by the West. They're all consumed in our mobile phones. The tin that is found in DRC is consumed in our computers. It's used as solder. A large percentage of the tin that is found in DRC goes into the world's solder manufacturing companies, which ends up in your computers and your phones. And so we actually have a responsibility as consumers to understand where our minerals are coming from, to understand that our consumerism is directly affecting the conflict in DRC, and that conflict then creates a system and a level of insecurity in the region, which allows these soldiers, these militias, and the government soldiers to act with impunity. If there's no effective court, if there's no effective civil prosecution in the region, then men feel that it's almost their right that they can go off and take these women and force themselves on these women in this way. And what we have to do, I think, is understand firstly that this war has to stop. International community, if they want this war to stop, if they had the motivation to make this war to stop, they could do it. Nkunda fought for over 10 years in DRC. This is General Nkunda, was fought for over 10 years in DRC, but when it didn't suit the Rwandan government anymore to have him there, he was immediately arrested. This can happen, again, with many other of the warlords that are working out there, and it can happen also with pressure being put on the Congolese government to make sure that their soldiers are hauled in and also educated. The whole problem here as well is that the men, many of the soldiers, feel this is their right, and they have to be told that it is not. Now, they have to be told that, you know, there can be change and there has to be change.
Now, presumably there hasn't been much impact then from President Kabila's effort to ban you know, mining in certain areas, to limit the mining in certain areas such as the east of the country. Marcus.
Limiting mining. Yeah, limiting mining in areas such as Eastern Congo, whilst I think internationally it draws attention to the problem, I don't think it is a solution. I think if you limit legitimate mining in a country, it only draws in illegitimate mining. Kabila saying that there is no mining allowed in eastern Congo doesn't necessarily mean that his soldiers themselves are not continuing, and that's what's happening. It's that the militia are pushed out and the local population are pushed out, but his Congolese government soldiers are still mining.
Now, Eve, just getting back to something you'd said about the inclusion of V-men now, the fact that men are actually realizing how much they are part of the solution as well as part of the problem is interesting, because I know that one of the key issues in the DRC is that many of the rapes are committed as gang rapes, and often that's seen as a rite of passage for men. They bond through it, and whereas the women are left totally ostracized. And I wonder, again, when dealing with that kind of situation, how you're able to at least make men be part of the vehicle for the solution, get them to spread the word about what harm is being done.
Well, I've been very impressed and actually very moved by the men who I was working with this last trip and the last 2 trips in Bukavu. And I think a lot of them have been inspired by Dr. Mukwege, who is the director of Panzi Hospital and who has been on the front lines of this war for the last 12 years, literally sewing up women as fast as the militias are ripping them apart. And he's really the godfather of the V-Men movement. And it was very fascinating this last trip because there were a lot of young doctors and a lot of young professional men in Bukavu who had really taken up the cause of V-Men. And I sat in on a few of their meetings, and I was just listening to what they were saying. And, you know, the Congolese army, it's a weird phrase, because what is it? Is there really such a thing as a Congolese army? It's a molding of warlords from other armies put into, and other countries melded into one army that isn't really a Congolese army. And I think there are many men in Congo who don't feel that the army represents them and that the violence represents them, and they have a very different sensibility. And I think the question is, how do men organize those men and bring those men forward? You'll find a lot of them in the universities, a lot of them are younger men, a lot of them are men who are just simply outside that system. And I was able to just sit and listen to men talking about the shame they feel, the horror they feel about what has been done to their sisters and their mothers and their girlfriends and their wives, and the lack of control, and how it's dehumanized them, and how it's made them feel less men, and how it's made them feel that they've lost any rights to their country, as well as to connecting to the women of their country. And I think as this movement grows and galvanizes, there is real hope for the future of the Congo, because I think as men begin to see that they are in great partnership and solidarity with the women who are being raped, and that no woman rapes herself. You know, 95% of the women, of violence that happens towards women in the world, unfortunately, is done by men. And I think when men really begin to see violence against women as their problem, and they're committed to it as deeply as women are to stopping it, I really believe things will change in the Congo.
And of course, Marcus, one of the key things I think as you document what's happening in the Congo is that many people don't realize it's the women that do a lot of the work. They're such a major part of the workforce, with many of the men being involved in militia and in the military in general. It's the women who actually take up a lot of the workload burden, isn't it?
It's not. The women take up about 90% of the workload, and they are about 90% of the economy in DRC. It's the women that give birth to the children. It's the women that collect the water. It's the women that do the cooking. It's the women that educate. The women that